Have you ever faced a situation where no matter how hard you try, nothing works? Where every effort seems useless and every plan fails? What if I told you that your weakness is not the end of your story, but the very stage for God's power to show up? Today, I want to show you how to turn your helplessness into a place of supernatural breakthrough. By the end of this message, you will understand how to let God's power prevail where you cannot. Don't miss this, because your miracle begins where your strength ends. Beloved, I want you to settle this truth in your heart today. Life will bring moments where you find yourself utterly powerless. There will be situations where no amount of strategy, no level of intellect, no reservoir of strength will deliver you. And it is in these very moments when human ability fails that the stage is set for the power of God to prevail. The Word of God tells us that His strength is made perfect in our weakness. That means the less you can do, the more room there is for His miraculous intervention. There is a profound lesson here. Your inability is not a mark of failure. It is an invitation for God to rise and display His majesty. When you cry out, Lord, where I am powerless, let your power prevail, you are not merely confessing weakness, you are activating divine intervention. Faith is not just believing God exists. Faith is believing that His power can operate in your exact situation, regardless of how impossible it looks. And this faith is not idle. It is persistent. It is unwavering. It refuses to relent, even when circumstances mock your prayers. You must understand that prayer is not about changing God. Prayer is about positioning yourself to receive His power. The moment you release your grip on control, the moment you surrender your limited understanding, is the very moment God begins to work. You may be powerless in wisdom, powerless in resources, powerless in influence, but you are never powerless in faith. Because when faith meets God's power, the impossible becomes possible. Expectancy is a spiritual principle. When you genuinely believe that the hand of God can intervene where you cannot, you will begin to see outcomes that defy logic. Mountains will move, chains will break, doors that were long shut will swing open. But remember, God's power never competes with your weakness. It fills it. His strength is not an addition to yours. It is a replacement for it. And that is why today, in the place of your helplessness, you must make this declaration: Lord, where I am powerless, let your power prevail. Do not despise your weakness. Do not be discouraged by your limitations. This is not a place of defeat. It is a place of divine opportunity. The same God who spoke the world into existence, who calmed storms with a word, who raised the dead, is willing and able to manifest His power in your life today. Let your surrender be total. Let your faith be unwavering, and watch as His power prevails where yours cannot. Beloved, the lesson is simply your powerlessness is the canvas. God's power is the masterpiece. Do not fight your weakness, embrace it. Declare it boldly in prayer, and let the power of God, unstoppable and limitless, prevail in every area where you cannot. every human being reaches a point in life where they must confront the reality of their limitations. There comes a moment when no amount of effort, intellect, or strategy can produce the desired result. And it is in such moments that the truth of our powerlessness becomes undeniable. Acknowledging this is not a sign of weakness or defeat. Rather, it is the beginning of spiritual clarity. Many people struggle with pride and self-reliance, thinking that their abilities alone can carry them through every circumstance. Yet the very fabric of human existence is woven with boundaries and constraints. We are limited in time, knowledge, physical strength, and even emotional capacity. Understanding and accepting these boundaries is essential because it opens the door for divine intervention. When we cling to the illusion of complete control, we inadvertently block the entry of God's power into our lives. Recognizing our limitations begins with honest self-reflection. It requires an internal confrontation where we admit that there are certain battles we cannot fight, certain problems we cannot solve, and certain situations we cannot change by human effort alone. Many people fail to experience breakthroughs simply because they refuse to acknowledge the depth of their helplessness. The moment we declare, even to ourselves, that we are powerless in a situation, we are creating space for a higher power to move. This acknowledgement is not passive resignation, but an active spiritual posture. It is a statement of truth. I cannot, but you can. When this truth is embraced, the human soul experiences a profound release from the burden of trying to control what is uncontrollable. In the spiritual journey, understanding one's limitations also cultivates humility. Pride thrives in self-sufficiency, but humility flourishes when we recognize that there are circumstances beyond our capacity. Humility is not thinking less of oneself. It is thinking less about one's ability to do everything alone and more about the greatness of the divine. This humility prepares the heart to receive divine wisdom and power. When we accept our limitations, we stop exhausting our energy trying to force outcomes and instead redirect that energy toward prayer, faith, and reliance on God. This is critical because human limitation is often the precursor to a spiritual awakening. A moment when we begin to understand that some solutions cannot be engineered by human effort. They must be revealed by God. Acknowledging limitations also brings clarity. When one accepts that certain areas are beyond personal control, it becomes easier to discern what steps to take and where to place trust. Human limitation forces us to differentiate between what we can handle and what we must surrender. Without this discernment, people often waste time and resources attempting the impossible. But by embracing our boundaries, we learn to focus on areas where our influence is effective while entrusting the rest to God's power. It creates a rhythm of action and surrender, a pattern where human effort is aligned with divine intervention. And this alignment is where miracles often emerge. Finally, acknowledging human limitations is deeply liberating. It frees us from the pressure of self-reliance, removes the weight of unrealistic expectations and opens the door to faith that is active and expectant. When we admit that there are moments where we are powerless, we are not conceding defeat. We are creating the perfect environment for God's power to manifest. Powerless moments, when embraced with humility and faith, become the stages upon which the extraordinary operates. It is in the recognition of our weakness that the strength of God can shine most brightly, demonstrating that human limitation is not the end of the story, but the beginning of divine possibility. Dependence on God's power is the cornerstone of spiritual life, yet it is a reality many people struggle to fully embrace. Human beings are naturally inclined to rely on what they can see, touch, or control. We trust our intellect, our skills, our resources, and our strategies because these are tangible and familiar. Yeah, there are circumstances in life that are far beyond the reach of human ability, situations where nothing we do can alter the outcome. It is precisely in these moments that dependence on God's power becomes not just necessary, but inevitable. To depend on God means to consciously acknowledge that human effort alone is insufficient, that our own strength, understanding, and influence have limits, and that true victory is only possible through the intervention of the divine. Dependence is not weakness, it is wisdom. It is the spiritual posture that allows the omnipotent power of God to operate unhindered in our lives. When we depend on God's power, we are essentially surrendering control. We are admitting that there are forces at work beyond our comprehension, and we place our trust in a power that is infinite, unchanging, and perfect. This surrender is critical because human beings often attempt to carry burdens that were never meant for them to bear alone. We strategize, plan, and struggle, believing that if we work hard enough, we can control every aspect of our lives. Yet, the Bible reminds us that God's power is made perfect in weakness. Meaning that when we reach the end of our own capacity, we create space for his supernatural intervention. Dependence, therefore, is not about inactivity or laziness. It is about shifting the source of power from ourselves to God. It is a deliberate choice to rely on what is unlimited rather than what is finite. Faith is the channel through which dependence on God's power flows. When we say, Lord, where I am powerless, let your power prevail, we are placing ourselves in a position where his strength can be demonstrated. True dependence is active, not passive. It involves seeking God in prayer, aligning our actions with his will, and believing that he is capable of achieving what we cannot. Dependence requires humility because it admits that we cannot do it alone. It requires patience because divine power often operates on God's timing, which is different from ours. And it requires trust because we are called to believe that God's ability is sufficient for every challenge, obstacle, or impossibility we face. Dependence on God's power also cultivates intimacy with him. When we recognize our limitations and rely entirely on his strength, we enter a partnership that goes beyond human effort. Our struggles become a platform for God's glory, and our victories are testimonies to His might. It shifts the focus from human achievement to divine accomplishment. Instead of boasting in what we have done, we learn to celebrate what God has done through us. This dependence transforms our perspective on life, helping us to understand that we are conduits of God's power rather than the source of it. Moreover, dependence on God's power produces peace amidst chaos. The world may present situations that are confusing, overwhelming, or frightening, but reliance on God's strength provides stability. When human effort fails, His power prevails. When circumstances appear hopeless, His intervention brings hope. When every door seems closed, His might opens the way. Dependence is not merely a spiritual principle, it is a practical lifeline that sustains the believer through the storms of life. Ultimately, dependence on God's power is the only way to navigate the moments where human ability is insufficient. It is in surrendering to His strength, trusting His timing, and believing in His omnipotence that we experience the miraculous. Human power has limits, but divine power has no boundaries. To depend on God is to step out of self, reliance, and into supernatural possibility. It is the spiritual posture that allows the Almighty to prevail where we cannot, turning our helplessness into a stage for His glory and our weakness into a testimony of His unstoppable power. Faith is the spiritual force that activates the power of God in the life of a believer. It is more than mere belief. It is the confident trust that God is able and willing to act on our behalf. Faith is the invisible lever that unlocks the supernatural, bridging the gap between human limitation and divine intervention. Many people live their lives hoping for miracles, praying casually, or waiting passively for change. But without faith, God's power cannot manifest in its fullness. Faith is the catalyst that transforms prayer from words into action and helpless situations into testimonies. It is the spiritual key that allows God's limitless strength to operate where human effort fails, turning impossibilities into realities. To understand how faith activates power, one must first recognize the difference between belief and expectation. Belief acknowledges God's existence and His general ability, but expectation is a personal and confident trust that He will act specifically in your situation. Faith moves beyond theory into practice. It positions the believer to receive God's intervention with certainty. When a person prays with faith, they are not simply asking, they are declaring that God's power is able to work in their circumstance. This is why Scripture consistently emphasizes that the measure of faith determines the measure of power that is manifested. Faith is not idle hope. It is an active stance, a spiritual posture that invites the supernatural to enter the natural. Faith also requires persistence and resilience. Circumstances rarely change instantly, and challenges often test the depth of our trust. It is in these moments of testing that faith becomes refined and strengthened. A faith that does not waver in the face of delay, difficulty, or opposition is the kind that activates power. God's power often operates in alignment with persistent faith because persistence demonstrates reliance, patience, and unwavering trust. When a believer refuses to give up despite the obstacles, they are effectively creating space for God to display his strength. It is this enduring faith that turns moments of despair into opportunities for divine intervention. Moreover, faith activates power because it aligns the believer's will with God's will. When faith is genuine, it is not a demand or manipulation. It is a submission that trusts God's wisdom, timing, and method. Human effort often seeks immediate results or works according to personal understanding, but faith places the believer in a posture of cooperation with the divine. This alignment allows God's power to work unhindered. Because the channel through which it flows, the believer's heart is receptive and obedient. Faith, therefore, is both a bridge and a conduit. It connects the believer to God's supernatural capability while ensuring that God's will is honored in the process. Faith also produces expectancy, which is a crucial component in the activation of power. Expectancy is the confident anticipation that God will act. It is a spiritual alertness that looks for the manifestation of his promises. When expectancy is combined with prayer, humility, and surrender, it creates a force field for miracles. Without expectancy, faith remains theoretical, but with expectancy, faith becomes operational. Expectant faith triggers divine response, causing God's power to be released in ways that are tangible, visible, and transformative. Ultimately, faith is the mechanism by which God's power is activated in our lives. Human weakness, limitation, or inability provides the opportunity, but it is faith that signals readiness for the supernatural. Faith does not create God's power because his power is infinite, but it creates the conditions for its manifestation. Through faith, the believer moves from helplessness to hope, from despair to confidence, and from limitation to divine possibility. Faith is the spark that ignites the supernatural, the lever that moves the unseen forces of heaven, and the spiritual key that ensures God's power prevails where human effort cannot. Persistence in prayer is one of the most powerful principles in the life of a believer because it demonstrates faith, determination, and reliance on God's power. Many people pray only when it is convenient or when they feel that the situation is urgent. But the depth of spiritual breakthrough often requires a steadfast and unwavering commitment to prayer. Persistence is not merely repetition of words. It is a determined posture of the heart that refuses to give up, even when circumstances remain unchanged or when answers seem delayed. Prayer is the channel through which God's power enters human situations, and persistence ensures that this channel remains open until the fullness of divine intervention is released. One of the key reasons persistence is necessary is that many situations in life cannot be resolved by a single prayer or moment of spiritual attention. Challenges are often complex, layered, and resistant to quick solutions. And it is in these situations that a persistent spirit becomes essential. Persistent prayer reflects a deep recognition of our limitations and an unwavering belief in God's unlimited power. It is a declaration that no matter how long the battle lasts, we trust that God is capable of providing a solution. When we persist in prayer, we refuse to allow discouragement, doubt, or impatience to limit the potential for divine intervention. Persistence also demonstrates faith in action. Faith is more than belief. It is an active trust that God will fulfill his promises. When we continue to pray, even when we do not see immediate results, we are expressing confidence that God's timing and methods are perfect. This active faith is attractive to God because it shows that we are not relying on human solutions or giving up in the face of difficulty, but are instead fully dependent on his supernatural power. Persistent prayer becomes the evidence that the believer is willing to endure and remain faithful regardless of temporary setbacks or apparent delays. Furthermore, persistence in prayer cultivates spiritual strength and discipline. It is not always easy to maintain focus, consistency, and intensity in prayer, especially when results are not immediate. Yet through persistence, the believer develops patience, endurance, and a deeper sensitivity to God's voice. These qualities are essential for spiritual growth because they prepare the heart and mind to receive revelation and direction. The process of persistent prayer trains the believer to persevere in the face of adversity, to maintain hope when situations look bleak, and to trust in God even when circumstances appear impossible. Another significant aspect of persistent prayer is that it positions the believer for breakthroughs that may not have occurred otherwise. God's power often operates in alignment with the perseverance of his children. The Bible repeatedly shows that those who persist in prayer and remain steadfast in seeking God experience miracles, deliverance, and unexpected solutions. Persistence signals readiness to receive, and readiness creates space for God to act. Without persistence, the believer may give up too early, missing the manifestation of divine power that could have transformed the situation. Persistence in prayer also strengthens the believer's intimacy with God. When we commit to sustained communication with the Lord, we develop a deeper awareness of his presence, his guidance, and his love. Persistent prayer becomes a conduit through which the heart aligns with God's will, allowing his power to flow unhindered. It transforms prayer from a routine activity into a spiritual dialogue that cultivates trust, expectation, and dependence on God's sovereignty. Ultimately, persistence in prayer is essential because it bridges human weakness and divine power. While we may be limited in our resources, understanding, and influence, our consistent, faithful, and determined communication with God creates the opportunity for his power to prevail. It is through persistence that the believer positions themselves for miracles, experiences spiritual growth, and witnesses the supernatural intervention of God in areas where human ability cannot suffice. Prayer is not just an act, it is a lifeline, and persistence ensures that this lifeline remains strong, steady, and effective, allowing the power of God to break through where human effort cannot reach. Surrendering control is one of the most profound acts of faith a believer can perform, because it directly opens the door for God's power to manifest. Human beings are naturally inclined to control their circumstances, to plan meticulously, and to rely on their own understanding and strength to achieve results. While planning and effort are important, there comes a point in every life when human control reaches its limit. At this junction, insisting on personal control often leads to frustration, stress, and missed opportunities for divine intervention. Surrendering control means recognizing that God's ways, His timing, and His methods are higher than ours, and it is in yielding our authority over situations to Him that true supernatural outcomes become possible. This act of surrender is not passive resignation. It is an intentional release that acknowledges God's supremacy and trusts His power to prevail where we cannot. The process of surrender begins with humility. Humility allows the believer to admit that they do not have all the answers and that their ability to influence outcomes is limited. Many people struggle with surrender because they equate letting go with weakness or incompetence. But the opposite is true. Surrender requires courage, because it involves giving up the illusion of control and trusting in a power far greater than oneself. It is a deliberate choice to place our plans, fears, and desires into the hands of God, acknowledging that His perspective surpasses our understanding. In doing so, the believer positions themselves for divine strategies that would have been inaccessible through human effort alone. Surrendering control also transforms the way we experience challenges. When we try to manipulate circumstances through our own strength, we are often limited by human constraints, emotional bias, and incomplete knowledge. By releasing control to God, we allow His wisdom and power to operate unhindered. This shift from human effort to divine operation ensures that outcomes are not just temporary fixes, but manifestations of lasting spiritual authority and provision. Surrender does not eliminate effort or responsibility. Rather, it aligns human action with divine purpose, making every effort effective because it is empowered by God. Faith and trust are inseparable from surrender. To surrender control is to trust that God's plan is perfect, even when it is not immediately visible or understandable. This trust requires patience because God often works in ways that are mysterious, slow, or contrary to human expectations. The believer who surrenders control recognizes that delays are not denials and obstacles are not failures. Instead, they are opportunities for God's power to be demonstrated more fully. Surrender creates a spiritual atmosphere where God's power can operate freely, unimpeded by human anxiety, interference, or impatience. Surrendering control also cultivates peace and stability in the believer's heart. Human beings often experience stress and restlessness when trying to manage outcomes that are beyond their capacity. Letting go of control shifts the focus from problem management to God reliance, replacing anxiety with assurance. This peace is not passive. It is an active spiritual posture that trusts the unseen hand of God to intervene in perfect timing. As believers release control, they find freedom from the burdens of worry, fear, and frustration, creating a fertile ground for divine power to manifest in ways that defy human reasoning. Ultimately, surrendering control is essential because it transforms helplessness into opportunity for God's intervention. The believer who relinquishes personal control is no longer constrained by human limitations. They create room for the limitless power of God to operate. Surrender is not a one-time act, but a continual posture of the heart, a daily choice to trust God above self. It is through surrender that human weakness becomes the canvas for divine strength. Personal limitations are replaced by supernatural provision, and God's power is allowed to prevail in every area where human effort falls short. In essence, surrendering control is the gateway to experiencing God's power fully, completely, and consistently in every aspect of life. Expecting supernatural outcomes is a principle that transforms the way a believer approaches life's challenges and aligns the human heart with God's limitless power. Too often, people approach prayer, effort, or spiritual pursuit with limited expectation, believing that God may act if it pleases Him, or that miracles are exceptions rather than norms. However, the believer who expects supernatural outcomes operates from a place of confident faith, recognizing that God's power is not constrained by human logic, circumstances, or impossibility. Expectancy is not wishful thinking or idle hope. It is an active anticipation, a spiritual stance that positions the heart to receive divine intervention in every area where human ability falls short. Expectancy creates the mental and spiritual environment necessary for miracles, deliverance, and supernatural solutions to manifest. At the core of expecting supernatural outcomes is belief in God's character and ability. It requires a deep understanding that God is omnipotent, unchanging, and faithful to His promises. Human effort has boundaries, human knowledge is limited, and human strength is finite, but God's power is infinite. The moment a believer truly internalizes this truth, their mind begins to operate in alignment with what is possible in the realm of the supernatural. Expectancy is not based on what we can do or understand. It is rooted in the certainty that God's power is sufficient to handle every situation. This certainty transforms despair into hope, impossibility into opportunity, and helplessness into faith-driven anticipation. Expectancy also works hand in hand with prayer, faith, and obedience. A believer who prays without expectation may go through the motions, but fail to activate the conditions for supernatural intervention. Similarly, faith without expectancy can remain theoretical rather than practical. Expectancy ensures that the believer approaches every challenge with confidence that God will act even before the manifestation is visible. It creates an active spiritual tension, a sense of readiness that the miraculous is not only possible, but imminent. The combination of prayer, faith, and expectancy positions the believer to experience the supernatural as a tangible reality rather than a distant hope. Moreover, expecting supernatural outcomes encourages persistence. When a person truly anticipates God's intervention, they refuse to be discouraged by delays, opposition, or apparent impossibility. They continue to pray, believe, and act according to God's guidance, knowing that His timing is perfect and that His power is sufficient. Expectancy generates patience, resilience, and determination because the believer understands that divine solutions often operate beyond human timeframes. Instead of giving up when circumstances remain unchanged, the expectant believer remains confident that the supernatural is on its way. And this confidence strengthens both the mind and the spirit. Expectancy also aligns the believer's perspective with the reality of God's kingdom. When one expects the supernatural, they are living in a realm where God's laws, rather than human limitations, govern outcomes. The natural impossibilities of life no longer intimidate them because they operate from the understanding that God's power can override every constraint. Mountains can be moved, chains can be broken, and doors that were long shut can swing open because the believer is positioned to receive divine intervention through expectation. It transforms challenges into opportunities for God to display His glory and allows the believer to experience life beyond mere human effort. Ultimately, expecting supernatural outcomes is about aligning one's heart and mind with the reality of God's limitless power. It is about approaching life's challenges with faith that God can, will, and is able to intervene. Expectancy creates the spiritual atmosphere where miracles become natural, deliverance becomes tangible, and blessings manifest beyond human calculation. It is the principle that turns human helplessness into divine opportunity, transforms ordinary situations into extraordinary testimonies, and ensures that God's power prevails in every area where human ability falls short. By expecting the supernatural, the believer positions themselves to experience life as God intended, full of divine possibilities, miraculous interventions, and victorious outcomes. Beloved, as we reflect on these truths, let us understand that life will bring seasons where our strength is not enough, our wisdom falls short, and our resources cannot meet the demand. But it is in these very moments of powerlessness that the glory of God is made visible. When we acknowledge our limitations, depend fully on His power, activate faith, persist in prayer, surrender control, and expect the supernatural, we are not merely hoping for change. We are positioning ourselves for divine intervention. Your weakness becomes the stage for His strength. Your helplessness becomes the canvas for His miracles, and your surrender becomes the channel for His limitless power. Today, make this declaration with your heart. Where you are powerless, let God's power prevail. Believe it, expect it, and watch as impossibilities give way to testimonies, and ordinary moments are transformed into supernatural encounters.